There comes a moment in life when something within you grows quiet, not out of defeat, but out of realization. The restless urge to chase, to prove, to pursue endlessly begins to dissolve. What once felt urgent now feels unnecessary. This is not indifference. It is transformation unfolding beneath awareness. When you stop chasing, you are not losing something outside of you. You are reclaiming something within. The energy once scattered in pursuit begins to return to its source. It gathers, strengthens, and reshapes your inner world. This shift is subtle yet powerful. Others may not understand it immediately, but one person will feel it deeply. This person begins to notice your absence, not just physically, but psychologically. The space you once filled with effort is now empty, and in that emptiness, something awakens within them. They begin to confront what your presence once shielded them from. Your silence speaks louder than your pursuit ever did. What they feel is not merely missing you, it is the disturbance of their own inner balance. When you chased, you carried the weight of the connection. Now that you have stepped back, they are left to face it alone. And in that confrontation, understanding begins to form. There is a strange paradox here. The moment you release control is the moment things begin to move, not because you forced it, but because you align with something deeper. The psyche does not respond to desperation, it responds to wholeness. By stepping away, you are no longer trying to complete yourself through another. You are no longer asking to be chosen. You are choosing yourself. This shift changes everything. It alters how you are perceived, but more importantly, it transforms how you exist. This person senses it. They feel that you are no longer orbiting around them. You have become centered within your own existence, and this challenges them. It forces them to question what they once took for granted. But this is not about making someone return. It is not a strategy or a game. It is a consequence of inner truth. When you stop chasing, you stop abandoning yourself. When you stop abandoning yourself, you become something undeniable. Whether they come closer or drift further is no longer your concern, because the real movement has already happened within you. You are no longer defined by the need to pursue. You are defined by the ability to stand still and remain whole. And in that stillness, something profound takes shape. Not something forced, not something fragile, but something real. The moment a person withdraws from constant pursuit, it often appears on the surface as loss, as if something valuable has slipped away or faded into distance, yet beneath that appearance lies a far more significant psychological shift that cannot be easily observed by those who remain attached to external outcomes. Because what is truly happening is not the disappearance of desire, but the reorientation of energy from outward fixation toward inward awareness, a movement that signals the beginning of inner transformation rather than emotional defeat, as the individual slowly detaches from the compulsion to chase validation, attention, or connection in ways that once felt necessary for a sense of completeness. And in doing so, they begin to encounter parts of themselves that were previously overshadowed by the urgency of pursuit, because chasing often serves as a distraction from the deeper confrontation with one's own unconscious patterns, fears, and unmet needs. So when that motion stops, there is an unfamiliar stillness that emerges, and within that stillness, the psyche begins to reorganize itself, no longer structured around longing for something outside, but instead grounded in the process of self-recognition, which can feel unsettling at first because identity had been partially built around striving and reaching, and without that constant movement there may be a sense of emptiness or uncertainty. Yet this emptiness is not a void of loss, but a space of potential where new awareness can take form. And it is within this space that a person starts to realize that what they were seeking externally often mirrored something unresolved internally. So the withdrawal becomes an act of reclaiming fragmented aspects of the self, allowing them to integrate rather than project onto others. And this integration gradually reduces the emotional dependency that once fueled the need to chase, replacing it with a quieter sense of stability that does not rely on external responses. And although others may interpret this change as disinterest or detachment, the truth is that it reflects a deeper engagement with one's own inner world, where meaning is no longer dictated by outcomes, but by alignment with one's authentic state of being. And this shift alters perception in subtle but profound ways, as the individual begins to see connections not as something to secure through effort, but as something that either resonates naturally or does not, removing the illusion that persistence alone can create genuine understanding or mutual recognition. And as this realization settles in, the emotional intensity that once drove the pursuit transforms into a more balanced awareness, where feelings are acknowledged without becoming overwhelming forces that dictate behavior. And in this balance, there is a growing sense of autonomy, where the self is no longer sacrificed for the possibility of connection. And this autonomy becomes the foundation of inner strength, because it is rooted in self acceptance rather than external approval. And from this place, the individual can engage with others without losing themselves in the process, no longer seeking to fill an internal gap, but instead sharing from a place of wholeness, which changes the nature of all interactions, making them less about need and more about genuine exchange. And even if certain connections fade as a result of this transformation, their absence no longer carries the same weight of loss, because the individual understands that what has been gained internally far exceeds what has been released externally. True connection does not arise from force, pressure, or calculated control, because anything shaped through compulsion carries within it the residue of imbalance, where one side attempts to secure what cannot be secured through effort alone, and the other side responds not from freedom but from influence. And in such conditions, what appears as closeness is often a constructed stability rather than a living bond. Since the psyche resists being controlled and eventually withdraws its authentic participation when it senses manipulation, whether subtle or direct, and this withdrawal may not always be visible immediately, but it gradually weakens the emotional authenticity of the interaction, replacing spontaneity with performance and presence with obligation, whereas true connection belongs to a different psychological order, one that emerges when both individuals are not bound by compulsion, but are instead allowed to exist in their own internal truth, where neither is attempting to dominate the emotional field, nor to secure certainty through excessive effort. And in this space, something more organic begins to unfold. Because without the pressure to maintain or control outcomes, attention becomes more present, perception becomes clearer, and emotional exchange becomes more honest, allowing what is real between two individuals to surface without distortion. And this emergence is not something that can be manufactured or forced into existence, as it depends on a certain psychological alignment where both presence and absence are respected, and where the need to possess or define the other gives way to the ability to observe and experience without interference. And in this state, the connection is not maintained through effort, but through resonance, a subtle alignment of emotional truth that does not require constant validation to exist. And it is precisely this absence of control that allows depth to develop, because when individuals are no longer trying to shape each other into expected roles, they begin to reveal themselves more authentically, not as projections or responses to expectation, but as they are internally structured, with their own contradictions, vulnerabilities, and clarity. And in this unveiling, there is a form of recognition that is not forced but naturally occurring, as if two inner worlds briefly align without negotiation. And this alignment cannot be sustained through pressure, only through continued authenticity, which means that any attempt to enforce connection paradoxically weakens it, while any willingness to release control strengthens its possibility. And in this paradox lies the deeper understanding that connection is not a possession but a phenomenon, something that arises when conditions allow it rather than when it is demanded. And as this understanding deepens, the need to chase validation or certainty from another begins to dissolve, because the individual recognizes that what is real does not require coercion to remain real, and what requires constant control is already unstable at its foundation. And from this awareness, a quieter form of relating becomes possible, where interaction is not driven by anxiety or expectation, but by presence and responsiveness. And in such interactions, silence is no longer threatening, but meaningful. Distance is no longer rejection, but space. And movement between closeness and separation is no longer interpreted as loss or gain, but as part of a natural rhythm that cannot be forced into permanence. And within this rhythm, true connection finds its most stable expression, not as something held tightly, but as something experienced freely, without distortion or demand. The psyche is not designed to remain trapped in extremes because at its core it is governed by an inherent drive toward equilibrium, a continuous movement between opposing forces that seeks integration rather than fixation. And when this natural tendency is disrupted, the mind begins to experience imbalance that often manifests as obsession, where attention becomes narrowed, emotional energy becomes concentrated on a single object, person, or idea, and the broader field of awareness is reduced to a repetitive loop of thought and feeling that feels compelling yet unstable, because obsession is not a sign of depth, but of imbalance where one aspect of the psyche dominates while others are suppressed or ignored, creating internal tension that feeds further fixation. And in this state, the individual may believe they are deeply connected or intensely focused. Yet what is actually occurring is a fragmentation of inner harmony, where the natural flow of psychological energy is obstructed and redirected into a singular channel that cannot sustain itself without constant reinforcement. And over time, this creates exhaustion, anxiety, and emotional dependency because the mind is no longer functioning in a balanced way, but is instead locked into a cycle of overinvestment and under-recognition of the self. And this is precisely where the deeper intelligence of the psyche begins to assert itself, not through force, but through disruption, as experiences arise that challenge the stability of obsession, whether through emotional distance, unmet expectation, or internal fatigue. And these disruptions are not punishments but corrective movements designed to restore equilibrium by breaking the rigidity of fixation. And when this process begins, the individual may initially experience resistance because the mind, accustomed to obsession, interprets balance as loss, as if releasing intensity means losing meaning. Yet what is actually being lost is distortion, not significance, and beneath that distortion lies a more sustainable form of engagement that does not consume the entire psyche, but allows it to remain whole. And as balance gradually returns, perception expands again, allowing multiple aspects of life and self to be felt simultaneously rather than filtered through a single dominant focus. And this expansion restores emotional flexibility, where feelings are no longer overwhelming or singular, but fluid and integrated. And in this state, the individual begins to recognize that what once felt like necessity was actually compulsion, and what felt like deep connection was often internal projection intensified by lack of balance. And through this recognition, a new form of awareness emerges, where attachment is no longer driven by unconscious repetition, but by conscious presence. And desire no longer collapses into fixation, but exists alongside detachment, creating a dynamic stability that allows experience without losing selfhood. And this is the point where the psyche naturally settles into its own rhythm, no longer swinging between extremes of obsession and emptiness, but resting in a more centered state where emotional energy is distributed rather than concentrated. And in this distribution, there is clarity, because clarity arises not from intensity, but from proportion, not from fixation, but from the ability to see beyond a single point of focus. And as this clarity strengthens, the pull toward obsession weakens, not through suppression, but through understanding, as the psyche recognizes that balance is not the absence of feeling, but the proper arrangement of feeling within the whole structure of awareness, allowing life to be experienced fully without being consumed by any single fragment of it. What is meant begins to align only when the self is no longer divided against itself, because fragmentation creates distortion in perception, where inner conflict, unresolved emotions, and competing desires pull awareness in different directions, causing what is seen, felt, and chosen to be filtered through inconsistency rather than clarity. And in such a state, even meaningful experiences become unstable in interpretation, as one part of the psyche longs for connection while another resists it. One part seeks truth while another fears its consequences, and this internal division creates a continuous interference that prevents life from being experienced in its direct form, instead converting it into projection, interpretation, and repeated misunderstanding. And this is why alignment cannot occur externally before it occurs internally, because external meaning is always received through the structure of the self that perceives it. And when that structure is fragmented, Meaning is fractured before it is even understood, leading to patterns of confusion where situations, relationships, and choices seem misaligned despite carrying potential coherence. Yet when fragmentation begins to dissolve, a subtle reorganization takes place within awareness, where opposing internal forces start to lose their compulsive dominance and no longer distort perception with equal intensity, allowing a more unified center of experience to emerge. And from this center, perception becomes less reactive and more receptive, less driven by contradiction and more guided by inner consistency. And in this state, what is meant no longer needs to be forced into recognition, because it is naturally perceived without resistance, as if the noise that once interfered with understanding has softened enough for clarity to appear on its own. And this clarity is not imposed but revealed through reduction of internal conflict, where emotional charges that once fragmented attention begin to settle, allowing the individual to see relationships, choices, and experiences as they are, rather than as they were interpreted through unresolved inner tension. And in this settling, there is a profound shift in how meaning is received, because alignment is no longer something sought externally, but something experienced internally as coherence between thought, feeling, and perception. And when this coherence strengthens, synchronicity between intention and experience becomes more noticeable, not because the external world has changed its nature, but because the internal lens through which it is perceived has become less divided, allowing what is appropriate, resonant, or aligned to be recognized without distortion. And this recognition does not arise from effortful analysis, but from an intuitive clarity that emerges when the psyche is no longer scattering its energy across conflicting directions. And in this unified state, even silence carries meaning. Absence becomes informative rather than confusing, and presence is experienced without projection, because the self is no longer attempting to compensate for internal fragmentation through external interpretation, and instead exists in a more integrated form, where perception and awareness move together rather than against each other. And within this integration, what is meant does not need to be deciphered or forced into understanding, because it is already aligned with the state of the perceiver. And this alignment creates a sense of ease in experience, where life is no longer constantly misread through internal division, but is allowed to unfold in its own coherence, revealing that meaning was never absent, but was previously obscured by fragmentation within the self itself.